Hi everyone, Drew Prody here, host of the Broken Brain Podcast. Every so often I get a message from someone saying, you know what, I don't know what my purpose is. Do you have any thoughts? And I'm like, yeah, I have a thought. I don't freaking know what my purpose is either. It doesn't stop me from doing my thing. It doesn't stop me from making podcast episodes. It doesn't stop me from trying new things out. And that's what today's episode is about. Today is Big Idea Tuesday, where I come to you with a thought, a distinction, a theme, an idea that's radically changed my life for the better. And today's topic is how to stop holding back and step into your purpose. Have you ever asked yourself, has every opportunity to shine been taken? Are there no more spots available in the universe to leave our unique mark? Has it all been said and done? Sometimes when we feel down, especially when we feel down, the only answer that we can come up with is yes. But it's worth remembering that this feeling isn't new. This feeling that everybody else has it figured out, they're doing their thing, and we're the only one that's confused. It's not a new feeling. It's worth remembering that we're not alone in that feeling. I've felt it before, and so many of the people that I look up to have felt it before. In fact, from the beginning of time, we know from the poets and the philosophers that have written about these topics, from the beginning of time, people have questioned their place on the planet. Our ancestors stared at the same stars and asked themselves the same questions we ask ourselves today. What are those questions? Do I matter? Why am I here? Will my life leave a mark? And most importantly, a question that's so common today, what's my purpose? These important questions, these are very important questions, but their answers can't be rushed. And we're in a generation and day and age where, especially with the downside of social media, it looks like everybody else has it figured out. So there's this anxiety that many of us feel, which is, I'm behind. I need to catch up. I'm not doing enough. I'm not being enough. I'm not giving enough. I'm not doing X, Y, and Z. Again, these are important questions, but their answers can't be rushed because the answers are layers and layers deep. We need to go through life lessons and experiences for them to show up, and those experiences take time. If we put too much pressure on these questions, we'll drive ourselves stuck. And the title of this podcast is How to Stop Holding Back, which is really how to break out of being stuck. We can actually drive ourselves stuck and push ourselves towards confusion. If any of you listened to last week's Big Idea podcast, we talked all about confusion. If we put too much pressure on these questions, we'll drive ourselves stuck. We'll hold off from building new things and taking risks, all because we're waiting to understand, quote unquote, understand ourselves before we get started. All because we feel we need to know our purpose. All because we feel we need to know our purpose before we give life our all. Can you relate to that? Have you ever not started something because you don't know if it fits your purpose, if it is your purpose? I want to tell you a little funny story. I'm going to interject over here with an interlude. I don't know if any of that made sense. I don't love the name of this podcast. This podcast is called Broken Brain. There's definitely guests that are out there. In fact, I reached out to the author, Stephen Pressfield, who I've seen sometimes here in Los Angeles at a cafe. And I was like, I'm a huge fan. I'm a really true fan. I'd love to have you on my podcast and talk about some of the stuff that's out there. And I can't know for sure, but I think that there's people that are out there that hear the title of this podcast, Broken Brain, and immediately have like a negative association. There's even some times where listeners write in and say, you know what? Just why is the podcast called Broken Brain? I'm like, well, listen, my business partner and I, Dr. Hyman, we made a documentary. It was called Broken Brain. It was all about how your brain isn't broken. I wanted to keep the conversation going, so I decided to host a podcast and continue the conversation for our community, and then the name stuck. I don't love the name, but I'm still making a podcast episode every week. I'm coming on 100 weeks of consistently making an episode and delivering value to people. And even though I don't love the name, and maybe one day I'll change it, I still put out content. I still try to interview people that bring you value. And the moral of that story is it doesn't have to all be understood before we get started. I'm going to read this section again that I wrote down. If we put too much pressure on these questions, we'll drive ourselves stuck. We'll hold off from building new things and taking new risks, all because we're waiting to understand ourselves before we get started. We're waiting to understand ourselves before we get started, all because we feel we need to know our purpose, all because we feel we need to know our purpose before we give life our all. You know, the important thing about this is this. There's been so many times in your life and mine that our lives have been touched by the work of others. Think about somebody's podcast you like, a book that you've read, that you've listened to on Audible or that you've read. I'm all tongue-tied this morning, but I'm not going to edit it out because you know what? It's good enough and you can get my heart and my sentiment through this. So there's been so many times in our life that our work has been touched, that our lives have been touched by the work of others. And you know what? Those people that touched our lives didn't have it all figured out. That's why I love biographies. When you go and read the biography of somebody that you really admire, or an autobiography, you see all the layers of, even though they were doing this bold, game-changing work, whether they were author, a business person, or TV host, on the outside, it looks like they had it all figured out and it was one smooth line, but then you read the inner workings of it and you see how messy it was. You see how many times they could have stopped and quit because they didn't have it figured out, but they continued. Those people that touched our lives didn't have it all figured out, and they didn't always know if they were headed in the right direction, but their work still touched us. They still left an impact. And here's a really important question for you, for me, for everybody who's listening. What would our life be like if those who impacted us, your favorite book, your favorite author, sports player, whatever it might be, somebody who's been an inspiration to you, what would your life look like if those who impacted you held back? What would your life and my life look like if they kept their gifts hidden from the world? Just think about that for a second. You know, one of my favorite authors is Eckhart Tolle, and his work so profoundly changed my life. I remember reading The Power of Now and feeling like, holy shit, I got it. And I got it on a deeper level than thought. There is nothing but the present moment. As basic as it sounds, when I read that book, I really felt it deep in my body. And the next day I was a different person. It's not like everything all of a sudden started working in my life, but I was fundamentally a different person through reading that work. And what would have my life been like if he held back? What would have my life been like if he kept his gifts hidden from the world? Fill that blank in with your favorite person that has impacted your life. You know, these bigger questions that we asked earlier, do I matter? Why am I here? Will my life leave a mark? What's my purpose? Those bigger questions will always be there. And our answers to them will get clearer and clearer the more that we live. I talk to a lot of my friends who have quote unquote made it on the outside, and they're still trying to figure out their purpose. They're still trying to figure out what they're trying to do. They're still continually growing. They have not felt like they've arrived and that it's all figured out and said and done. It's a continuous process. So just remember, the bigger questions will always be there, and our answers to them will get clearer and clearer the more that we live. Reflection is great. Sometimes we sit and we reflect and we're like, okay, I need to think about, is this really what I want to do? That's a great use of reflection. And reflection is great, but there's no need to hold off showing up till we have it all figured out. When reflection turns into analysis paralysis, that's when we drive ourselves stuck. Are you stuck right now? Are you stuck in some avenue or area of your life that's connected to your purpose? Are you in analysis paralysis? Are you overthinking the situation? You know, I want to read you an early review of this podcast. This podcast here, the Broken Brain Podcast. This is from July 15th, 2018. The title is Zero Energy. The audio is terrible, so endlessly long, and no energy. I think that they mean that the host, yours truly, has no energy. It's a tough listen. I know there's great info here, and I'll still subscribe, but it's delivered in a drone. There's so many better podcasts that are out there deserving of our limited time. Great. That's what somebody wrote. That was an early review. It was one of the first reviews of this podcast. Now, I could have read that review and decided that I was going to hold back, that I was going to stop, that I was going to not share the gifts that I had, which I love asking questions to people that are interesting and inviting them on this podcast. I could have said, I'm going to stop. I'm going to hold off. Or I need to rethink this. Is this really the right thing for me to do? Or I could have just kept going. And that's what I did. I said, okay, great. You know what? The audio was not that great in the beginning. We didn't have good mics. I didn't have a team. I was interviewing people on Skype. I'm not good at interviewing people remotely. I'm better at interviewing people in person. So I'm not going to write it off and say, fuck that person. They don't know what they're talking about. You don't need to do that. You just need to say, okay, great. That's a perspective. I'm going to keep going because I'm going to figure it out. I'm going to figure it out. And also, this is the most important part of this podcast. Why am I here? Am I here for me? Or am I here for you? Am I here to provide value to the audience? If my focus is on the audience, if my focus is on the people who are listening, whether that's 1 people or 10 million people. By the way, we just crossed 10 million downloads on the Broken Brain Podcast. Again, thank you for being here. Doesn't mean I have 10 million listeners. I probably have more like 100,000 listeners. But either way, I'm fantastic. Even though if there was 2 listeners, I have to ask myself, and anybody who's trying to pursue their creative talents in the world, share, give, not just be a cog in the wheel, but actually share their unique talents with the world, has to ask themselves, is this about you? Or is this about the people that you're trying to support, help, inspire, take care of, and be there for? Because most importantly, we have to remember there's someone out there that needs your work. If we get stuck in analysis paralysis where reflection goes overboard and we use analysis as an opportunity to hold off showing up till we have it, quote unquote, all figured out, then we forget that the focus is on being there for other people. There's someone out there that needs your work. There's someone out there that needs you to show up in only the way that you know how. Think about somebody that's inspired you. Think about somebody who made a massive difference in your life. What if they held back? What if they kept their gifts hidden from the world? How would your life be different now? Well, in that same vein, when you hold back, you're doing that to someone else. There's someone out there that needs your work. There's someone out there that needs you to show up in only the way that you know how. Take your fear, take your purpose, take all your questions along with you, and just keep doing. Keep showing up, and don't hold back. Much love to you guys. This is Drew Pruitt. I'll see you next week for another Big Idea Tuesday.